Hello! Welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
The sun rose lazily over the horizon, casting a soft golden hue across the sprawling fields of Miguel's farm. The early morning air carried a crisp freshness, mingling with the earthy aroma of dew-covered grass. Miguel adjusted his hat as he made his way down the gravel path toward the barn, his boots crunching lightly with each step. This was his favorite time of day, before the demands of managing his estate and his businesses claimed his attention, before the world outside intruded on the solitude he'd come to cherish. Despite his immense wealth, Miguel had never embraced the extravagance expected of someone in his position. He had worked his way up from nothing, building his empire brick by brick, but his heart had always remained with the land. The farm wasn't just a retreat. It was a connection to something real, something grounding in a world that often felt superficial. As he approached the barn, something unusual caught his eye. The heavy wooden door, which was always shut tight at the end of the day, was slightly ajar. Miguel's brows knitted together in confusion. He distinctly remembered asking Anna, his longtime housekeeper and one of the few people he trusted implicitly, to ensure everything was locked the night before. His mind raced through the possibilities. Had one of the workers forgotten to secure it? Or worse, was someone trespassing? He quickened his pace, his senses on high alert. The faint creak of the door as he pushed it open echoed in the quiet morning. The familiar smell of hay and wood greeted him, but it wasn't the only thing that caught his attention. There, nestled among the bales of straw, was a figure. Miguel froze, his eyes narrowing to take in the unexpected sight. It was a young woman, curled up tightly, her body partially hidden by the shadows of the barn. Her clothes were tattered and dusty, her hair a wild mess cascading over her face. She looked so small, so fragile, as if she were trying to make herself invisible to the world. For a moment, Miguel stood there, unsure of what to do. His instincts told him to be cautious. After all, he didn't know who she was or why she was there, but another part of him couldn't ignore the vulnerability etched into her posture. It wasn't every day that someone like him, a man used to control and precision, was confronted with such an unexpected scene. Clearing his throat to announce his presence, Miguel took a step closer. The sound startled the woman awake, and she bolted upright with a gasp. Her wide, startled eyes met his, and for a second, neither of them spoke. She looked terrified, like a deer caught in headlights. "It's okay," Miguel said softly, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman didn't respond immediately. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her breathing erratic as she scrambled to her feet. Miguel noticed how unsteady she was, her knees shaking beneath her as if she hadn't eaten properly in days. "Who are you?" Miguel asked, keeping his tone calm and measured. "What are you doing here?" She hesitated, her eyes darting around the barn as if searching for an escape route. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I didn't mean to trespass. I just needed somewhere to rest." Her voice was hoarse, almost broken, and Miguel couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. There was something in her tone that spoke of exhaustion, of desperation. "What's your name?" he pressed gently, trying to piece together the puzzle in front of him. "Clara," she replied after a pause, her voice trembling. "Clara," Miguel repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "Well, Clara, this isn't exactly a safe place to sleep. Do you have anywhere else to go?" She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the floor. "No," she admitted, barely audible. Miguel sighed, running a hand through his thick, dark hair. He wasn't sure what had led her to this point, but it was clear that she was in trouble. Leaving her here wasn't an option, not with how vulnerable she seemed. "Come with me," he said finally, gesturing toward the barn door. Clara's eyes widened in alarm. "No, I can't." "You can," Miguel interrupted firmly, though his voice remained kind. "And you will. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. At least let me get you some food and a safe place to rest." Reluctantly, Clara nodded, though her posture remained guarded. Miguel led the way back to the main house, his mind racing with questions. Who was this woman? What was she running from? And why had fate placed her in his barn on this particular morning? The farmhouse was a beautiful, rustic structure with wide verandas and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Miguel ushered Clara inside, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. Anna, the housekeeper, appeared in the hallway, her brow furrowing in confusion at the sight of Clara. "Mr. Miguel, who is this?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with suspicion. "This is Clara," Miguel said simply. "She'll be staying here for a while." Anna's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she gave Clara a once-over, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I'll prepare a room," she said curtly before disappearing down the hall. Clara shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of Anna's disapproval. Miguel noticed and offered her a reassuring smile. "Don't mind her," he said. "She's just protective." He led Clara to the kitchen and gestured for her to sit at the large wooden table. Within minutes, a plate of food was in front of her, eggs, toast, and a slice of fresh fruit. Clara hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the fork. "You don't have to worry," Miguel said, sitting across from her. "You're safe here." Clara looked at him, then really looked at him, as if trying to gauge whether she could trust him. There was something in Miguel's steady gaze that seemed to put her at ease, and slowly, she began to eat. As she did, Miguel studied her. She couldn't have been much older than her mid-20s, but there was a weariness in her eyes that suggested she had lived through more than her fair share of hardship. The urge to ask her more about her past was strong, but he held back. He could see she wasn't ready to open up just yet. For now, it was enough that she was here, safe and out of the cold. But as Miguel watched Clara, he couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival was no coincidence. There was a story behind her presence in his barn, a story he was determined to uncover, no matter how complicated it might turn out to be. The farmhouse felt quieter than usual, an almost surreal calm settling over it as Clara rested in the guest room. Miguel stood by the window of his study, looking out at the fields that stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. The morning sun painted everything in hues of gold, but his thoughts were far from serene. The unexpected arrival of this mysterious woman had stirred something in him, an unease mingled with curiosity. He didn't know her story yet, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and exhaustion, that hinted at struggles far greater than she was letting on. Miguel wasn't a man who easily involved himself in other people's problems. Years of navigating the business world had taught him to be cautious, even distant when necessary. And yet, he found himself drawn to Clara, as if there were invisible strings pulling him closer to her truth. A soft knock on the study door broke his train of thought. It was Anna, her sharp eyes filled with quiet disapproval. "She's asleep," Anna informed him, folding her arms. Poor girl must have been running from something or someone. Miguel turned to face her, leaning against the wooden desk. "What do you think?" he asked, knowing Anna wouldn't hold back her thoughts. "I think it's not our business to pry," Anna replied bluntly. "But you've always had a soft heart for strays, Mr. Miguel. Just be careful. We don't know who she is or what trouble she might bring with her." Miguel nodded slowly. Anna was right, of course. Clara's sudden appearance in his barn could mean anything: a runaway, a victim, or even someone with a dangerous past. But something in his gut told him that Clara wasn't a threat. "Let's give her time," he said finally. "She's clearly been through something. When she's ready, she'll tell us." Anna didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. "I'll prepare lunch. You should keep an eye on her, though." Miguel smiled faintly. "I will." "Thanks, Anna." Hours later, Clara woke to the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by exhaustion she hadn't realized she carried. For a moment, She didn't move, her mind trying to piece together where she was and how she'd gotten there. Then it hit her. The barn, the stranger who had found her, the warm kitchen, and the plate of food that had filled her empty stomach. She sat up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the soft light filtering through the curtains. The room was simple but cozy, a small wooden dresser, a bedside table with a lamp, and a quilted blanket that had kept her warm. It felt safe, something Clara hadn't felt in a long time. But safety was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had learned that the hard way. Clara swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. She hesitated, debating whether to stay or leave. Miguel's kindness had caught her off guard, but she couldn't let herself get comfortable. People were rarely kind without wanting something in return. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet except for the faint clatter of dishes coming from what she assumed was the kitchen. Clara followed the sound, her steps hesitant. Miguel was sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening. "Good morning," he greeted, his deep voice calm and inviting. Clara nodded, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Good morning," she replied quietly. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit. "Yes, thank you," Clara said as she took the seat opposite him. Anna entered the room, setting down a loaf of freshly baked bread and a plate of butter. She gave Clara a polite but reserved nod before retreating to the pantry. Miguel leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "I don't mean to push Clara, but I think we should talk." Her body tensed, and she avoided his eyes. "About what?" "About why you were sleeping in my barn," he said gently. I don't want to pressure you, but I need to know if you're in any kind of danger." Clara's throat tightened. She had spent the past few days running, hiding, trying to disappear. The thought of opening up to someone, even someone as seemingly kind as Miguel, terrified her. But at the same time, the weight of carrying her secrets alone was suffocating. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted after a long pause. Her voice cracked, and she hated how vulnerable she sounded. Miguel didn't press her further, sensing how fragile she was. Instead, he nodded and poured her a cup of coffee. "You don't have to explain everything now," he said. "But as long as you're here, you're safe. I'll make sure of it." Clara looked at him, her guard softening just slightly. There was something about Miguel, his calm demeanor, his unwavering gaze, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. "Thank you," she murmured, her fingers curling around the warm mug. As the days passed, Clara began to settle into the rhythm of life on the farm. She helped Anna in the kitchen, tended to the chickens, and even ventured out to the stables where Miguel showed her how to feed the horses. It was a strange kind of peace, one she hadn't known in years. But even as she started to feel at home, Clara couldn't shake the shadows of her past. At night, when the house was quiet, her mind replayed the events that had brought her here. The arguments, the threats, the fear that had driven her to flee. Miguel noticed the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden noises or avoided certain questions. He didn't push her, but his curiosity grew with each passing day. Who was Clara, really? And what was she running from? One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Miguel decided to break the silence. "You know," he began, his voice low, "this place has seen its fair share of stories. People come here to start over, to escape, to heal. I'm not saying you have to tell me yours, but I'd like to help, if I can." Clara's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her skirt. She wanted to tell him, wanted to unburden herself, but the fear of judgment held her back. "Maybe one day," she said softly. Miguel nodded, accepting her answer. One day, then, but that one day came sooner than either of them expected. Late that night, Miguel was woken by the sound of muffled cries. He got up quickly, following the sound to Clara's room. The door was slightly ajar. and he could see her curled up on the bed, trembling and sobbing in her sleep. "Clara," he said gently, stepping inside. She jolted awake, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, she didn't recognize him, her mind still trapped in whatever nightmare had gripped her. "It's okay," Miguel said, his voice steady and calm. "It's just me." Clara's breathing was ragged, and tears streamed down her face. She tried to compose herself, wiping at her cheeks, but Miguel knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to hide it," he said softly. "Whatever it is, you're not alone anymore." And in that moment, something inside Clara broke. The walls she had so carefully built around herself began to crumble, and she finally let herself cry, really cry, for the first time in years. Miguel stayed with her, his presence a quiet comfort. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand answers. He simply let her be, knowing that sometimes the first step to healing is simply having someone to lean on. But as Clara's sobs subsided and she drifted back to sleep, Miguel made a silent vow. Whatever she was running from, whatever pain she carried, he would do everything in his power to help her find peace. The morning sun filtered through the farmhouse windows, bathing everything in a warm, golden glow. Birds chirped outside, their melodies weaving through the hum of the breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers. Yet, the peaceful surroundings stood in stark contrast to the turmoil inside Clara's mind. She sat by the kitchen table, staring blankly at the plate of scrambled eggs and toast that Anna had prepared for her. Her appetite was gone, replaced by the weight of the nightmares that had plagued her the night before. She could still feel the raw vulnerability of having broken down in front of Miguel. It scared her how easily he had seen through her walls, how much she wanted to trust him despite every instinct telling her otherwise. Miguel entered the room, his usual composed demeanor softened by a hint of concern. He glanced at her untouched plate and frowned. "Not hungry?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Clara forced a small smile. Just not much of a breakfast person. Miguel didn't press her. He learned quickly that Clara spoke in half-truths, revealing only fragments of herself. But he wasn't one to give up easily. "Well," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her, "if you're feeling up to it, I could use some help in the barn today. The horses need grooming, and it's always easier with two people." Clara hesitated. She appreciated the way Miguel never demanded anything from her, how he always gave her the space to decide for herself. And yet, she felt a pull to say yes, to take small steps toward normalcy. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll help." The barn was alive with the soft rustle of hay and the occasional snort of the horses. Miguel showed Clara how to brush their coats in smooth, gentle strokes, his voice calm and patient as he guided her. "You're a natural," he remarked, watching as Clara tentatively worked on one of the older mares. Clara let out a small laugh, the sound surprising even herself. "I doubt that. I've never even been near a horse before." "Well, you're doing better than I did my first time," Miguel admitted, a grin tugging at his lips. "I was so nervous. I dropped the brush and spooked the horse. Let's just say it didn't end well for either of us." Clara smiled, the corners of her mouth curving upward in a way that felt foreign but good. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to forget the weight she carried. But the reprieve was short-lived. As they worked, a truck rumbled up the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. Clara's body tense, her grip tightening on the brush. She turned instinctively toward the sound, her eyes wide with alarm. Miguel noticed her reaction immediately. "Hey!" he said softly, stepping closer to her. "It's just a delivery truck. They're dropping off supplies for the farm." Clara's shoulders relaxed slightly, but her heart continued to race. Miguel didn't miss the way her gaze darted toward the barn doors, as if mapping out an escape route. "Clara," he began cautiously, "who are you afraid of?" She froze, her back to him, her hands trembling. She wanted to tell him, to unburden herself, but the words felt like shards in her throat. "It's complicated," she whispered. Miguel stepped closer, his voice steady but gentle. "I'm not here to judge or force you into anything, but if someone's looking for you, I need to know. I can't help you if I don't understand what's going on." Clara turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, she considered running again, disappearing before things got too complicated. But something in Miguel's gaze, a mix of patience and quiet strength, made her pause. "I was married," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Miguel's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. "Go on," he encouraged. Clara took a shaky breath, the words spilling out like a dam had broken. "It wasn't a good marriage. He wasn't a good man. Controlling, cruel. And when I finally got the courage to leave, he swore he'd find me. He said I'd never be free of him." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, ashamed of the tears that threatened to fall. Miguel's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "He hurt you," he said, more a statement than a question. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "You don't have to go back," Miguel said firmly. "Not ever. Not while you're here." Clara met his gaze, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "You don't understand," she said. "He has money, power. He can make people disappear. If he finds me—" Miguel stepped closer, his voice low but resolute. "Let him try. I won't let anything happen to you, Clara." His words sent a rush of emotion through her, gratitude, fear, and something she couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile but real. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara sat on the porch, lost in thought. The weight of her confession lingered, but so did Miguel's promise. Anna joined her, handing her a steaming cup of tea. "You're not the first person to end up here looking for a fresh start," Anna said, her tone softer than usual. Clara looked at her, surprised. "Really?" Anna nodded, her gaze distant. "Miguel has a way of helping people without asking for much in return. This farm, it's more than just a place to live. It's a sanctuary for people like us." "Like us?" Clara echoed. Anna hesitated, then sighed. "I had my own demons when I came here. Miguel didn't pry, didn't push. He just gave me a place to heal. He'll do the same for you, if you let him." Clara stared into her tea, her thoughts swirling. Could she really let herself trust Miguel? Could she let herself believe that she was finally safe? But as the stars began to the night sky, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her past wasn't finished with her. Late that night, a shadow moved along the edge of the property. A man stood just beyond the tree line, his dark eyes fixed on the farmhouse. He pulled out a phone, dialing a number. "I found her," he said, his voice cold. The man ended the call and disappeared into the darkness, leaving no trace of his presence. Inside the farmhouse, Clara slept fitfully, unaware of the danger that was drawing closer. The morning dawned with a pale pink hue streaking across the horizon, casting a tranquil glow over the farm. The dew sparkled on the grass like tiny diamonds, and the gentle hum of crickets faded as the first rays of sunlight kissed the earth. But the serenity outside did little to calm Clara's restless mind. She had spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by the memories she had shared with Miguel. Speaking those words aloud had felt like reopening old wounds, and the vulnerability lingered like a weight in her chest. Miguel noticed the faint shadows under her eyes as they gathered for breakfast. Clara tried to mask her exhaustion with polite conversation, but her mind was miles away. Miguel didn't push, though his concern deepened. He knew there was more she hadn't said. Secrets buried so deeply they were etched into her every movement. After breakfast, Clara offered to help Anna in the vegetable garden. She needed to keep herself busy, to distract her from the growing sense of unease. She couldn't explain it, but something felt off. It was as though invisible eyes were watching her, and every rustling leaf or distant sound set her heart racing. Anna, ever perceptive, noticed Clara's jumpiness. "You seem tense," Anna remarked as they knelt by the rows of tomato plants. Clara hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She liked Anna. There was a kindness in her that reminded her of the sister she had lost touch with years ago. But trust didn't come easily to Clara, not anymore. Just a rough night, Clara said with a forced smile. Anna studied her for a moment before nodding. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. No judgment, no questions. Clara managed a genuine smile this time. Thank you, Anna. That means a lot. Meanwhile, Miguel was working in the barn, but his mind was far from the task at hand. He couldn't shake the image of Clara's haunted expression when she spoke about her past. There was a fire in her, a resilience that had carried her this far. But there was also a fragility that made him fiercely protective. As he brushed down one of the horses, Miguel glanced out of the barn doors. Something caught his eye, a glint of light reflecting off metal at the edge of the property. He froze, his instincts kicking in. He stepped closer, squinting against the sunlight, but the figure disappeared into the tree-line before he could get a better look. Miguel's jaw tightened. The farm was isolated, and visitors were rare. Whoever had been there wasn't a friendly neighbor stopping by for a chat. He made a mental note to check the property's perimeter later. For now, he wouldn't say anything to Clara. She already seemed on edge, and he didn't want to worry her unless he had concrete evidence. By midday, Clara found herself wandering near the edge of the property. She told herself she was just exploring, but deep down, she knew she was drawn to the quiet of the woods. It was a place where she could think, where the weight of her past felt a little lighter. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Clara inhaled deeply, the earthy scent of the forest calming her nerves. She found a fallen log and sat down, her fingers absently tracing the rough bark. She thought of Miguel and Anna, of the sanctuary they had given her. She wanted to believe that this place could be her fresh start, but the shadows of her past loomed too large. Could she ever truly be free of him? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a branch snapping nearby. Clara's heart leaped into her throat as she shot to her feet, her eyes darting around the woods. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the eerie silence of the forest. She backed away slowly, her instincts screaming at her to run. But just as she turned to head back to the farmhouse, she caught sight of something, a cigarette but freshly extinguished, lying on the ground. Clara's stomach churned. Someone had been here, and they weren't far away. She broke into a sprint, her feet pounding against the earth as she raced back to the safety of the farm. Miguel was in the barn when Clara burst in, her face pale and her breathing labored. "Clara?" he asked, rushing to her side. "What happened?" She struggled to catch her breath, clutching his arm for support. Someone was in the woods. "I heard them, and I found this." She held up the cigarette, but her hands shaking. Miguel's expression darkened as he took the evidence from her. He had been right. Something was wrong. "I'll take care of it," he said firmly. Clara grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Miguel, you don't understand. If it's him—" Her voice broke, and Miguel felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at whoever had made her live in such fear. "Listen to me," he said, his tone gentle but resolute. "You're not alone anymore, Clara. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Clara wanted to believe him, but the fear was too ingrained. She nodded reluctantly, her trust in him warring with her instincts to run. That evening, Miguel walked the perimeter of the property, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of intruders. He found a set of footprints near the tree-line, leading toward the farmhouse but stopping abruptly. Whoever it was had been watching, observing. Miguel's fists clenched at his sides. He would not let anyone harm Clara or disrupt the sanctuary he had built. He would double down on security, make sure she felt safe here. But as he returned to the farmhouse, a thought nagged at him. This wasn't just a random trespasser. Clara's past was catching up to her, and he had a sinking feeling that things were about to get much worse. Inside, Clara sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames as they danced and crackled. Anna joined her, sensing her need for company. "You're safe here," Anna said softly, placing a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder. Clara nodded, but the knot in her stomach remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that her time here was running out. As the night deepened, the farmhouse grew quiet, but just outside the window, in the shadow of the trees, a figure stood watching. The man's eyes glinted with malice as he surveyed the warm glow of the farmhouse. He had found her. The night descended heavily upon the farm, the darkness wrapping around it like a suffocating shroud. The faint chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees were the only sounds that punctuated the stillness. Yet for Clara, the silence was anything but calming. It felt ominous, a harbinger of something lurking just beyond the edges of safety. She sat by her bedroom window, her knees pulled to her chest as she stared out into the blackness. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every whisper of the wind, sent her heart racing. Her mind replayed the events of the day. The cigarette butt, the snapping branch, the footprints Miguel had found. All of it pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Someone had found her. Her eyes darted to the bag she kept under the bed, the one she had packed hastily the night she fled. It was her safety net, her escape route if things went south. But as she glanced around the cozy room, the thought of leaving filled her with a pang of sadness. For the first time in years, she had begun to feel like she belonged somewhere. Miguel's kindness, Anna's warmth, they had given her hope. But was it too good to last? Miguel, on the other hand, was far from ready to let Clara's fear dictate her future. After securing the farmhouse as best as he could, he found himself pacing the living room, his mind churning with plans. He had installed extra locks on the doors and windows, and made sure the old shotgun his father had left behind was loaded and within reach. But his efforts felt inadequate. Whoever was out there wasn't just some random stranger. This was someone with intent. And intent, Miguel knew, was far more dangerous than curiosity. Anna emerged from the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea, her expression etched with concern. She handed one to Miguel and sat down on the worn couch. "You're worried about her," she said, more as a statement than a question. Miguel nodded, taking a sip of the tea. Its warmth did little to ease the cold knot in his stomach. "She's terrified, Anna, and for good reason. Someone's out there, and I don't think they're just passing through." Anna frowned, her hands tightening around her mug. "Do you think it's tied to her past?" Miguel hesitated. Clara hadn't given him all the details, but the little she had shared was enough to tell him she was running from something or someone. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." The clock struck midnight, and the farmhouse was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Clara had finally managed to drift into a restless sleep, though her dreams were plagued by shadows and faceless figures chasing her through endless woods. Outside, the figure that had been watching earlier made his move. His steps were calculated, his movements silent as he approached the farmhouse. He had waited long enough. The glow of the living room light had gone out hours ago, and he was certain the occupants were asleep. He crouched by the side of the house, his hand brushing against the cold steel of the knife strapped to his belt. The memory of Clara's defiance, her escape, burned in his mind. She had humiliated him, made him look weak, but he would make her pay. Miguel's eyes snapped open, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. He sat up in bed, straining to hear past the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the nightstand. And then he heard it, a faint creak, like the sound of a floorboard under pressure. His pulse quickened as he reached for the shotgun propped against the wall. Moving silently, he made his way out of his room, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The farmhouse was dark, the only light coming from the moonlight spilling in through the windows. He crept down the hallway, his grip firm on the shotgun. As he approached the stairs, he caught a flicker of movement in the shadows below. His jaw tightened. Someone was in the house. Clara woke with a start, her heart pounding as though she had been running. It took her a moment to orient herself. to realize the scream that had jolted her awake hadn't come from her dreams. It was real. She froze, her ears straining to catch any sound. The house was eerily silent, but the faint creak of footsteps sent a jolt of fear through her. She scrambled out of bed, her hands fumbling for the small lamp on the nightstand. The light flickered on, casting long shadows across the room. Clara's eyes darted to the door, her breathing shallow. Then she heard it, a deep, commanding voice she recognized instantly. "Stay where you are," Miguel's voice boomed from downstairs. Miguel stood at the base of the stairs, his shotgun leveled at the intruder. The man was tall and wiry, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But Miguel didn't need to see his face to know he was dangerous. The knife clutched in the man's hand told him everything he needed to know. "Drop the knife," Miguel ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The intruder smirked, the moonlight glinting off the blade as he twirled it between his fingers. "You think that'll scare me?" the man sneered. Miguel's finger tightened on the trigger. "Try me." The standoff felt like it lasted an eternity. Miguel's eyes never wavered from the man, his stance unwavering. But then, the intruder took a step forward, his grip tightening on the knife. Miguel didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the floorboards, the sound echoing through the farmhouse like a thunderclap. The man flinched, his smirk vanishing as he stumbled back. The momentary distraction was all Miguel needed. He lunged forward, knocking the knife out of the intruder's hand with the butt of the shotgun. The man stumbled, but Miguel was on him in an instant, pinning him to the ground. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale as she clutched the railing. Her eyes widened in shock as she took in the scene below. Miguel holding the intruder down, the knife lying a few feet away. "Miguel!" she cried out, her voice trembling. "Stay back!" he barked, his focus remaining on the man beneath him. The intruder struggled, but Miguel's grip was ironclad. "Who sent you?" Miguel demanded, his voice a low growl. The man chuckled darkly, his gaze flicking to Clara. "You know exactly who." Clara's blood ran cold. She gripped the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Miguel glanced up at her, his expression softening. "Clara, call the sheriff." She nodded, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the phone. As the red and blue lights of the sheriff's car illuminated the farmhouse an hour later, Clara felt a mix of relief and dread. The intruder had been taken into custody, but his parting words lingered in her mind. "This isn't over," he had whispered, his eyes locking onto hers as the sheriff led him away. Miguel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his presence grounding her. "We'll deal with this," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Clara nodded, but as she stared into the dark woods beyond the farmhouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that her past was far from done with her. The morning light filtered weakly through the farmhouse windows, a fragile promise of safety after the harrowing events of the night. The air inside was heavy with tension, the echoes of fear and adrenaline still lingering. Miguel stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he stared into the distance. The shotgun rested in the corner, a grim reminder of the confrontation that had shaken their sanctuary. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her eyes, red from sleeplessness, were fixed on the floor, replaying the man's parting words. "This isn't over." The phrase felt like a curse, a shadow that refused to lift. She had always known her past would catch up to her, but she hadn't anticipated how deeply it would affect the people who had come to mean so much to her. Anna entered the room quietly, her expression strained. "The sheriff called," she said, breaking the silence. "The man's name is Evan. He has a record: assault, theft, intimidation. They're holding him for now, but it's not enough," Miguel finished grimly. Clara glanced up, her voice barely a whisper. "It won't stop him. Not for long." The weight of her words settled over them like a storm cloud. Miguel pushed off the counter, his jaw tightening. Then we'll make sure he can't hurt you again." "How?" Clara asked, her voice laced with despair. "He'll come back. And next time, he won't be alone." Miguel's gaze softened as he moved to sit beside her. "We'll figure it out. Together." The word hung in the air, a beacon of hope Clara didn't know she could trust. Together. She had spent so long running alone, relying only on herself, that the idea of leaning on someone else felt foreign. And yet, as she looked into Miguel's steady eyes, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in years: belief. That afternoon, Miguel and Clara worked side by side to fortify the farmhouse. They installed new locks, reinforced the doors, and set up motion-activated lights around the property. It was a Band-Aid solution, but it gave Clara a sense of agency, a small way to fight back against the fear that threatened to consume her. Anna, meanwhile, made phone calls to trusted contacts in town, seeking advice and support. The small community had its flaws, but it also had its strengths. Neighbors who looked out for one another, who didn't shy away from standing up for what was right. By evening, the farmhouse was as secure as they could make it. But the real battle, Clara knew, wasn't just about locks and lights. It was about confronting the ghosts of her past. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the field, the tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. The farm stretched out before her, a place that had quickly become more than just a refuge. Miguel joined her, his presence solid and reassuring. They stood in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "I need to tell you the truth," Clara said finally, her voice breaking the quiet. Miguel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Evan, he's not just some random guy. He's part of the life I ran away from. I used to be involved with people like him, dangerous people. I didn't have a choice back then, but when I finally found a way out, I took it. I've been running ever since." Miguel's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "They don't like it when someone tries to leave," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "Evan was sent to find me, to bring me back, or to make an example of me if I refused." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Miguel reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore, Clara," he said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." That night, Clara found herself unable to sleep. The farmhouse was quiet, but her mind was anything but. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when a faint noise outside caught her attention. Her heart jumped into her throat as she slipped out of bed and moved to the window. The moonlight illuminated the field, and at first she saw nothing. But then in the distance, she spotted movement, a shadow slipping through the tall grass. Clara's pulse quickened. She grabbed the flashlight Miguel had left by the door and tiptoed downstairs. She didn't want to wake him unless it was necessary. Stepping out onto the porch, she shone the flashlight into the field. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. For a moment, there was no response. But then, a figure stepped into the beam of light. Clara's breath caught. It wasn't Evan. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She held up her hands in a gesture of surrender. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need help." Clara hesitated, her instincts warring with her empathy. The woman looked terrified, but Clara couldn't ignore the possibility that this was a trap. "What do you want?" Clara demanded, keeping the flashlight trained on the stranger. The woman took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Evan, he's coming. He's not alone. They're planning to—" Her voice broke, and she struggled to continue. "He told me to lure you out, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't—" Clara's stomach dropped. She stepped back into the house, slamming the door and locking it. Then she ran to wake Miguel. Within minutes, the farmhouse was alive with urgency. Miguel, shotgun in hand, stood by the front door, his expression grim. Anna had joined them. Her phone pressed her ear as she called the sheriff again. The woman, who introduced herself as Rachel, sat trembling in the kitchen. Her story spilled out in fragments, but the message was clear. Evan and his men were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Miguel tightened his grip on the shotgun. "We're not running," he said firmly. "This is our home, and we're not letting them take it." Clara felt a surge of gratitude and fear. For the first time in years, she had people willing to fight for her. But she also knew the cost could be devastating. The hours that followed were a blur of preparation. Miguel and Anna worked quickly, setting up makeshift barricades and preparing for the confrontation they knew was inevitable. Clara, despite her fear, refused to hide. She stood alongside them, determined to face whatever came next. When the first headlights appeared on the horizon, a chill ran down Clara's spine. The car stopped just short of the farmhouse, and figures emerged, silhouetted against the night. Evan's voice cut through the darkness. "Clara, you've had your fun. Time to come home." Miguel stepped onto the porch, the shotgun aimed at the group. "She's not going anywhere." Evan laughed, a cold, menacing sound. "You think that'll stop us?" "Try me," Miguel shot back. What followed was a standoff filled with tension, threats, and ultimatums. But as the sheriff's sirens pierced the night, Evan and his men realized they were outmatched. They retreated, their threats echoing in the distance. As dawn broke, the farmhouse was quiet once more. The danger had passed, but Clara knew it wasn't over. Yet, as she stood with Miguel and Anna, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. For the first time, she wasn't running. She had a home, people who cared for her, and the courage to face whatever came next. And that, Clara realized, was a first step toward true freedom.